When my husband Daniel pulled me aside during our company's annual Christmas party at the Grand Marriott Ballroom, his face pale with panic and his voice trembling with what I initially mistook for concern for my well-being, and whispered urgently in my ear, "Get out, they know your secret." My blood ran cold as I tried to process what secret he could possibly be referring to, and who among our colleagues and their spouses might have discovered something about my past that I had worked so carefully to keep private throughout my successful career as a senior marketing director at one of the city's most prestigious advertising agencies. The Christmas party was supposed to be a celebration of our company's record-breaking year, and an opportunity for employees and their families to enjoy an elegant evening of dinner, dancing, and recognition for outstanding achievements. But Daniel's cryptic warning transformed what should have been a joyful social occasion into a nightmare of anxiety and confusion, as I tried to understand what information had allegedly been discovered, and why my husband seemed more terrified than I was about the potential consequences of exposure that he was treating as catastrophic rather than manageable. As I made my excuses to colleagues and hurried toward the exit with my heart pounding and my mind racing through possible explanations for Daniel's panic, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about his warning didn't make sense, and that his knowledge about whatever secret had supposedly been discovered suggested a level of involvement in my personal history that I had never shared with him despite 5 years of marriage that I had believed was built on trust, honesty, and mutual support through all of life's challenges and uncertainties. What I discovered when I arrived home that evening would reveal that the real secret wasn't something from my past that others had uncovered, but something happening in my present that Daniel had been hiding from me while using my own vulnerability and trust against me in ways that would fundamentally change my understanding of our marriage and force me to confront the reality that the person I had loved and trusted most in the world had been systematically betraying me while pretending to protect me from threats that existed only in the elaborate deception he had constructed to control and manipulate my behavior for his own selfish purposes. The secret that I had assumed Daniel was referring to in his panicked warning was related to my background as the daughter of a convicted embezzler whose financial crimes had been front-page news in our city 15 years earlier, creating a scandal that had destroyed my family's reputation and forced me to rebuild my identity and career from scratch in a different state, where my father's notoriety wouldn't overshadow my own achievements and professional capabilities. The embezzlement case had involved my father's theft of over $2 million from the nonprofit organization where he had served as chief financial officer, money that had been intended for children's educational programs and community development projects that had been funded by donors who trusted the organization to use their contributions effectively and honestly for charitable purposes that would benefit underserved populations and create positive change in our community. The aftermath of my father's arrest and conviction had been devastating for our entire family, as the media coverage had been extensive and sensationalized, painting our household as a family that had been living luxuriously off stolen charity money, while children in need were deprived of educational opportunities and support services that had been funded by generous donors who believed their contributions were making a difference in vulnerable communities. The reality had been far more complex and painful, as my mother and I had been completely unaware of my father's criminal activities, and had been as shocked and devastated as anyone when FBI agents had arrived at our home with search warrants and evidence that revealed the extent of his deception and financial manipulation that had been hidden behind a facade of professional competence and charitable commitment. The financial ruin that had followed my father's conviction had forced my mother and me to declare bankruptcy and lose our family home, as the civil lawsuits and restitution requirements had claimed every asset we owned, while also making it impossible for either of us to find employment in our hometown, where our association with the embezzlement scandal made us unemployable, despite our innocence and lack of involvement in my father's criminal activities. The decision to relocate to a different state and rebuild our lives under circumstances that would allow us to establish new identities and professional reputations had been necessary for survival, but it had also required me to carefully manage information about my background and family history in ways that would prevent my father's crimes from destroying my own opportunities for education, career advancement, and personal relationships that might be jeopardized by association with his notoriety and criminal conviction. The years of careful identity management that had been necessary to build my successful marketing career had involved strategic decisions about what personal information to share with colleagues, clients, and romantic partners, always walking the fine line between privacy and deception while trying to build authentic relationships that weren't overshadowed by my father's criminal history and the stigma that often attached to family members of convicted felons, regardless of their own innocence and character. The emotional toll of constantly monitoring my words and managing my personal narrative had been exhausting and isolating, creating barriers to intimacy and genuine connection that had made it difficult to form the kind of deep friendships and romantic relationships that required complete honesty and vulnerability about one's past experiences and family background. The professional success that I had achieved in the advertising industry had been earned through exceptional performance, creative innovation, and the kind of work ethic and integrity that had been shaped by my determination to prove that my character and capabilities were completely separate from my father's criminal behavior and moral failures that had caused so much pain and destruction in our family and community. The senior marketing director position that I held at Morrison & Associates was the result of 8 years of increasingly responsible roles and successful campaigns that had generated millions of dollars in revenue for clients, while also establishing my reputation as someone who could be trusted with confidential information and high-stakes projects that required discretion and ethical decision-making. The relationship with Daniel had begun 3 years earlier when he had joined our company as a business development manager, bringing impressive credentials from his previous position at a competing agency, and demonstrating the kind of ambition and professional competence that had made him an attractive colleague and eventual romantic partner who seemed to share my values regarding career advancement and personal integrity. Our courtship had been conducted partly within the professional environment where we both worked, creating opportunities for him to observe my work style and professional relationships, while also developing personal chemistry and mutual attraction that had evolved naturally from respect and admiration into romantic love and eventual marriage. The decision to marry Daniel had felt like a natural progression of our relationship, and a sign that I had successfully built a new life and identity that wasn't defined by my father's criminal history, or the trauma and stigma that had shaped my early adulthood and professional development in ways that had required careful navigation and strategic decision-making about disclosure and privacy. Daniel's apparent acceptance of the limited information I had shared about my family background had seemed to indicate that our relationship was strong enough to weather any revelations about my past that might eventually become necessary, as our intimacy and commitment deepened through marriage and shared life experiences. The marriage itself had been a small ceremony attended by close friends and colleagues, with minimal family involvement due to my mother's health issues and my father's continued incarceration, that made his presence impossible and undesirable for an occasion that was supposed to represent a fresh start and positive future, rather than a reminder of past trauma and family dysfunction that had been so painful and disruptive to overcome. Daniel's family had been welcoming and inclusive, treating me as a beloved addition to their close-knit group without asking intrusive questions about my own family circumstances or expressing curiosity about the absence of my relatives from our wedding celebration and subsequent family gatherings. The first 2 years of our marriage had been characterized by professional success for both of us, with Daniel earning a promotion to Senior Business Development Manager and expanding his responsibilities to include major client relationships and strategic planning that had increased his visibility within our company and the broader advertising industry, where networking and reputation were essential for career advancement and business development opportunities. My own career had continued to flourish with successful campaigns and client satisfaction that had led to increased responsibility and compensation, while also providing the financial security and professional credibility that had validated my decision to rebuild my life and career in ways that honored my values while protecting my privacy and emotional well-being. The changes in Daniel's behavior that had begun approximately 6 months before the Christmas party had been subtle at first, involving increased secrecy about his work activities and phone calls, unexplained absences from our home during evening and weekend hours, and a growing tendency to deflect questions about his daily activities and professional relationships that had previously been topics of open and comfortable conversation between us. The explanations he had provided for these changes had centered around new client responsibilities and confidential projects that required discretion and additional time commitments, reasons that had seemed plausible given the competitive nature of our industry and the demanding expectations that often accompanied career advancement and increased professional responsibility. The financial changes that had accompanied Daniel's behavioral shifts had included unexplained expenses and cash withdrawals that seemed inconsistent with our household budget and spending patterns, along with his increasing reluctance to discuss our joint financial planning and investment strategies that had previously been collaborative decisions based on shared goals and mutual trust in each other's judgment and commitment to our shared future. The credit card statements and bank records that I had access to as his spouse had shown charges and transactions that didn't align with his explanations about work-related expenses and business entertainment, creating questions about his activities, and spending priorities that he had deflected with irritation, and accusations that I was being controlling and suspicious without justification. The social isolation that had gradually developed during this period had involved Daniel's increasing reluctance to attend company social events and professional networking activities where our colleagues and their spouses would expect to see us together as a married couple, along with his suggestions that I might want to decline invitations or attend events independently, rather than as his partner and companion. The explanations he had provided for avoiding these social occasions had involved claims about work pressure and the need to maintain professional boundaries that would prevent conflicts of interest or appearance problems that might affect his business development activities and client relationships. The Christmas party where Daniel had delivered his panicked warning had been an event that we had both been expected to attend as senior members of our company's management team, and his initial reluctance to participate had been overcome only after direct requests from our CEO and assurances that client entertainment and team building were essential aspects of our professional responsibilities that couldn't be avoided without career consequences. The elegant venue and festive atmosphere had created an opportunity for colleagues and their families to celebrate our company's success, while also building personal relationships and social connections that would support future business development and collaborative projects. The moments leading up to Daniel's warning had been unremarkable, with normal conversations about work projects and holiday plans that had characterized our interactions with colleagues and their spouses throughout the evening, giving me no indication that anyone present had discovered information about my background or had any reason to discuss my family history or personal circumstances that I had carefully kept private throughout my tenure with the company. The panic in Daniel's voice and the urgency of his demand that I leave immediately had been so unexpected and extreme that I had complied without question, trusting that his knowledge of the situation was accurate and that my immediate departure was necessary to prevent some kind of professional or personal disaster that he was trying to help me avoid. The drive home from the Christmas party had been filled with anxiety and confusion, as I tried to understand what secret had allegedly been discovered, and how the exposure might affect my career and personal relationships that had been built on carefully managed privacy about my family background and father's criminal history. The phone calls I had made to Daniel during the drive had gone directly to voicemail, adding to my concern that something serious was happening that required his immediate attention, and preventing him from providing the reassurance and explanation that I desperately needed to understand the scope and implications of whatever crisis he believed was developing. The arrival at our home had been anticlimactic, with no evidence of media attention, legal problems, or any other indication that my secret had been exposed or that I was facing the kind of professional or personal consequences that Daniel's panic had suggested were imminent and unavoidable. The house was dark and quiet, exactly as we had left it earlier in the evening when we had dressed for the Christmas party, and discussed our expectations for an enjoyable evening of professional networking and social celebration with colleagues and their families. The decision to check Daniel's home office while waiting for his return and explanation had been motivated by my growing suspicion that something about his warning didn't make sense, and that his knowledge of whatever had allegedly been discovered suggested access to information or people that he had never mentioned in our conversations about work and professional relationships. The office space that Daniel had claimed was necessary for client confidentiality and business development activities had always been off-limits to me, with explanations about professional ethics and legal requirements that had seemed reasonable given the sensitive nature of advertising industry work and client relationships. The documents and computer files that I discovered in Daniel's office revealed a truth far more shocking and devastating than any exposure of my own family background could have been, as I found evidence of an elaborate scheme involving identity theft, financial fraud, and the systematic exploitation of my professional reputation and client relationships for illegal activities that had been conducted under my name and using my credentials, while I remained completely unaware of the crimes being committed by someone I had trusted with my heart and my future. The identity theft documentation showed that Daniel had been using my personal information and professional credentials to establish fraudulent business relationships and financial accounts that had been used to embezzle money from our company's clients, while creating a paper trail that would implicate me as the primary suspect if the scheme was ever discovered by law enforcement or internal auditing procedures. The sophistication of the fraud revealed months of careful planning and execution that had required intimate knowledge of my work habits, professional relationships, and personal information that only a spouse would have access to through daily cohabitation and shared confidences. The financial records that I found in his files showed that Daniel had stolen over $500,000 from multiple client accounts over the previous 18 months, using forged documents and electronic access codes that had been obtained through his position as business development manager and his access to my personal and professional information that had enabled him to create convincing fraudulent transactions and communications. The money had been transferred to offshore accounts and investment vehicles that would make recovery difficult and prosecution complex, while also creating the appearance that I had been the mastermind behind the embezzlement scheme rather than an innocent victim of someone else's criminal activities. The most devastating discovery was evidence that Daniel had been planning to frame me for his crimes while disappearing with the stolen money, leaving behind a trail of evidence that would make me appear guilty of the same kind of financial crimes that had destroyed my father's life and reputation 15 years earlier. The cruel irony of being set up for embezzlement charges by someone who knew about my family's trauma and my desperate desire to avoid any association with financial crimes was a level of betrayal that exceeded anything I had ever imagined possible from someone who had claimed to love and protect me throughout our relationship and marriage. The computer files that contained Daniel's communications with accomplices and money laundering contacts revealed that his pursuit of our relationship had been strategic rather than romantic, motivated by his knowledge of my family background and his calculation that my desperation to avoid any association with financial crimes would make me an ideal scapegoat for his own criminal activities that he had been planning since before we had ever met. The emails and messages showed detailed discussions about my psychological vulnerabilities and my patterns of behavior that could be exploited to create the perfect setup for financial fraud that would be attributed to me while he escaped with the stolen money and a new identity in a country without extradition treaties. The timeline of our relationship that emerged from these documents showed that Daniel had researched my background extensively before engineering our initial meeting at the company, using information about my father's embezzlement conviction and my subsequent efforts to rebuild my identity and career as leverage for manipulating me into a relationship that served his criminal purposes rather than any genuine romantic feelings or commitment to building a life together. The level of calculation and emotional manipulation that had characterized our entire relationship was staggering in its cruelty and sophistication, representing years of sustained deception that had exploited my trust and vulnerability for criminal purposes that would have destroyed everything I had worked to rebuild after my father's crimes had devastated our family. The panic that Daniel had displayed at the Christmas party had not been motivated by concern for my well-being or discovery of my own secret, but by his realization that our company's year-end financial audit was about to uncover evidence of his embezzlement scheme, and that he needed to accelerate his timeline for framing me and disappearing with the stolen money before law enforcement and internal investigators could identify him as the actual perpetrator of the financial crimes that had been conducted using my identity and professional credentials. The phone call that I made to law enforcement from Daniel's office that night was one of the most difficult and important decisions of my life, as I realized that my only chance of avoiding prosecution for crimes I hadn't committed was to provide evidence of Daniel's actual guilt, while also exposing myself to potential scrutiny, an investigation that might reveal my family background and create the very publicity and stigma that I had worked so hard to avoid throughout my career and personal life. The decision to prioritize truth and justice over privacy and self-protection represented a fundamental shift in my approach to managing my past and my identity, choosing transparency and accountability over the secrecy and control that had characterized my adult life since my father's conviction. The investigation that followed my report to authorities moved quickly once law enforcement had access to Daniel's files and computer records, with forensic accountants and financial crimes investigators tracing the money trails and fraudulent transactions that clearly established his guilt, while exonerating me of any involvement in the embezzlement scheme that had been designed to destroy my life and career, while enriching someone who had systematically betrayed my trust and love for criminal purposes. The arrest of Daniel at the airport as he attempted to flee the country with forged identity documents and access to offshore accounts containing the stolen money provided dramatic confirmation of his guilt, while also revealing the extent of his criminal network and the sophisticated planning that had been involved in creating the fraud scheme that had exploited my identity and professional reputation for financial gain. The media coverage of the case focused on the unusual circumstances of a husband framing his wife for embezzlement, using her family's traumatic history with financial crimes as psychological leverage for manipulation and control, creating public sympathy for my situation, while also exposing the personal details about my background that I had worked so hard to keep private throughout my professional career and personal relationships. The legal proceedings that followed Daniel's arrest included my testimony about the deception and manipulation that had characterized our relationship, along with expert witness testimony about the psychological dynamics of long-term fraud schemes, and the vulnerability of individuals with trauma histories to manipulation by criminals who exploit their fears and insecurities for personal gain and criminal purposes. The conviction and sentencing that concluded Daniel's case resulted in a 20-year prison sentence for embezzlement, identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy charges that reflected the severity of his crimes and the extensive harm that had been caused to multiple victims, including myself, our company, and the clients whose money had been stolen through his elaborate deception and betrayal of professional and personal trust. The professional recovery that followed the resolution of Daniel's case included support from my employer and colleagues, who recognized that I had been an innocent victim of sophisticated criminal manipulation, rather than a participant in the financial crimes that had been committed using my identity and credentials, leading to opportunities for career advancement and increased responsibility that validated my professional competence and ethical character. The personal healing that began after Daniel's conviction required extensive therapy and support to process the trauma of discovering that my entire marriage had been based on deception and criminal manipulation, along with the additional challenge of managing public exposure of my family background and personal history that had been revealed through the legal proceedings and media coverage of the case. Today, 5 years after that Christmas party where Daniel warned me to get out because they know your secret, I understand that the real secret was his criminal conspiracy and betrayal of our marriage, not my family's past trauma that he had exploited for his own criminal purposes while pretending to love and protect me from exposure and judgment. The lesson that emerged from this experience is that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones with the most to hide, and that our own vulnerabilities and shame about past experiences can be exploited by criminals who understand how to manipulate fear and trauma for their own benefit while maintaining facades of love and protection that conceal their true motives and criminal activities. Was I naive to trust Daniel completely despite his increasing secrecy and behavioral changes? Or should I have been more suspicious of his explanations and demands for privacy that prevented me from discovering his criminal activities? Should people with traumatic family histories be more cautious about sharing personal information with romantic partners who might exploit their vulnerabilities for criminal purposes? Would you have made the same choice to contact law enforcement immediately upon discovering evidence of your spouse's crimes, even knowing that it would expose your own private family history to public scrutiny? Sometimes the most important decision we can make is choosing truth and justice over privacy and self-protection, even when that choice requires courage to face consequences that we have spent years trying to avoid through secrecy and careful identity management that ultimately provided no real protection against betrayal by someone we trusted completely.